We used to throw parties at the house that we had for um, the ballet company. We also had an opera singer who was a roommate, and so we would throw these sort of mixed arts parties. And then there were people who were not feeling well, and then were getting dropped by the company. And John got sick, and he wasted away. Um, and he was really the first close friend that I watched die every day at home. In the leather community, first I saw it in some of the men who were older than I was by, and I would say at this time they were probably men in their uh, 30s and 40s, who were travelers, who were people who had friends and community members across the country, and were sick. And the um, the atmosphere of what that was looking like, especially on Capitol Hill, was watching people get thinner, to go from being, very, in some cases, very bulky, hard working out kinds of guys to um, skeletal specters. There were a couple of guys that I had known also through the leather community. Steve Madoff is one of them, who had been, on he'd been a Washington State Mr. Leather title holder. He'd been a drummer title holder. He had run for international Mr. Leather. He looked like a Tom of Finland poster come alive. And when he died, he was less than 100 pounds. And I remember very clearly going to my doctor at Swedish Medical, and asking for an HIV test. And she looked at me and she said, "Well, you're a woman. You don't need an HIV test." And that was my first understanding that people who were really on the ground, the community that this was really affecting, knew more than the medical professionals that were treating us or serving us, unless they themselves were also part of the queer community. Um, and I had to educate her on transmission, and that her assumption, because I had a female partner, that I was and her assumption that I was monogamous was not accurate, and that she should not tell people what they should or shouldn't think about in terms of getting tested, but that she should actually invite people regardless of gender. And a lot of that was because of the disparities in health services around HIV for women. A lot of that was because women often have to take care of other people first, and we're looking to their health last. But another reason for it was because a lot of the symptoms that women got were really around their reproductive systems. And for the people who were doing studying of the effects of HIV, they were not looking at women's reproductive histories and and the differences. So where we knew that men at the time, one of the symptoms that they had, one of the effects that they had was thrush. The fact that women were getting yeast infections, there was really no knowledge that those two things were the same in so many ways. That, we're talking about yeast infections just in a different part of the body, but because women could get infections for a lot of different reasons, they were just treated as a matter of fact cause, and not looked at for HIV. And so there was a real need, a real thirst for learning more about how HIV affected women, and getting that information out, and getting the Northwest AIDS Foundation to create a whole sort of women's support program, and taking a look at the way that medicine was treating women. And one of my good friends at Pacific Northwest Ballet was a guy who now lives in Vancouver, who was one of their main dancers, Hugh. And Hugh was an out gay man, and he was a magnificent ballet dancer. His solo work was extraordinary. He never, ever got the chance to dance a leading part. It was never cast as, you know, the Nutcracker Prince in the Nutcracker. He was always Herr Drosselmeyer. He was always Mercutio. He was never Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. He always had the roles of the individual man who is the odd man out, literally. You know, Hugh, I remember all of the biographies. There were always, you know, an important thing in the program notes was always if somebody was married, if they had kids. And for the men like Hugh or like my roommate John, it was just, you know, like there was like this absence. And that was the way that, you know, we sort of learned who might be queer, was like, where's the absence of any information about family life? What was happening was that, you know, who else are we as a community was you know, coming into the forefront. Who are the rest of the community? What do we look like? What do we need that is not specifically around illness or around this specific illness? And so the Pride Foundation was founded to take a look at other parts of creating change and supporting lasting change in the LGBTQ community, and specifically in Seattle and then in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest. And I was really excited by that because it meant there would be hope. You don't realize sometimes what can happen in terms of what seems like we've always had something and what we never had. Because I was the, you know, development director, and so I got a phone call from one of the local radio stations that said, "Hey, we just heard that there's going to be this gay card." Where you can, you know, that one of the banks is going to be doing this, and it's going to go to, you know, tell us about your organization, what's it like? And so I answered the question, so, you know, and said, you know, I think it's really important. And the questions, you know, from the radio station started to get a little hostile, and, you know, about, you know, well, do you really think it's, you know, people should be funding, you know, folks who are having perverted sex and, you know, things like that? And I was like, you know, it's a nonprofit organization. And, you know, the questions continued with, you know, nonprofit organization that's, you know, telling kids to have gay sex or all of this kind of stuff. And I finally hung up, and the banker who was on the board came to the office. He had not been out at the bank, and that radio piece meant that he had to out himself at the bank, and he had been doing all of this very quietly, and it had been so profoundly frightening that the bank immediately stepped away from doing the card, and I was asked to resign because the idea of having you know, a credit card where funding could go to an LGBT nonprofit was just so shocking. And was so perverse that that the consequences were that he almost lost his job and I lost mine. The pre-AIDS, the middle of AIDS, the immediate post-AIDS, and then as I think of the generation of folks who are growing up never not having HIV as part of a conversation, are very, very different in terms of responses. And it's not a good or bad thing. It's about what we lived with. It's about the level of structural and systemic stress that we lived through. It's about whether or not you could ever acknowledge that you were in a relationship with someone. I think of, like, I have a friend who for years brought his a female friend of his to parties for decades. Um, covered up the fact that he was a gay man. And then there's me, who will say that I got married in 1998, even though it wasn't legal in this country, because I did have, a queer wedding. But there's a generation after me that was like, that are like, of course when I get, I'm going to get married. They're like, what's the big deal? There are, it really, these are generational shifts. And I don't know if they would have taken place so rapidly had it not been for the AIDS crisis, and to have to literally fight for our lives and fight for our visibility, against something that was literally killing us.